So you can give them to your neck band quite easily. So the next speaker is Andrea Ross-Gillespie, and she's going to be telling us about African penguins off the west coast.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to be talking very briefly, this is a lightning talk, on some work that I've done in the last few years involving penguins. Now, the African penguin population has been declining quite steadily over the last decade or so. You can see over here, it's a plot of the number of breeding pairs on 2 of the islands off the west coast. And if now the penguins feed almost exclusively on anchovy and sardine. Now, if we superimpose the sardine biomass, or the estimated biomass, you can see that that has also been quite a steady decline. So now the question is, to what extent is this decline in the sardine or the fish population responsible for the decline in the penguin population? So to try and address this, in 2008, an island closure experiment was initiated. And essentially what this was involved was for 4 of the islands on which penguin colonies breed, there was a 10 nautical mile area around the island that was closed to the fishery. These are 2 of the islands on the west coast, and there were 2 more on the south coast. And this was done in an alternating method. So Dasson Island would be closed for 3 years while Robben Island's opened, and then Dasson would be open while Robben is closed. And then during this time, there's obviously data that were collected, and these data were supposed to give a measure of the general health of the penguin population. So when we take this data and then we apply a random effects model. So there's a random mu effect, but what we're really interested in is there's a fishing effect and a closure effect. So the fishing effect essentially trying to see what the magnitude of the catches of the anchovy and sardine populations, how that's impacting the penguin population. And then the closure effect, that X parameter is 1 when the island is open and 0 when it's closed. So trying to see, is the closure of the island having an impact on the penguin population? Now, as is very often the case in science and when you're working with real data, there wasn't enough information to conclusively say one way or the other, what the impact was of the fishing industry. So the question is, should you continue with the closure experiments? Bearing in mind that each year that you close the islands, it's a huge cost to the fishing industry. But on the other hand, just because we haven't spotted an effect doesn't mean it's not there. It's just that there's not enough information in the data to support the hypothesis one way or the other. So we ask ourselves another question. Assuming there is a biological meaningful impact of the fish on the penguin population, how long do we need to continue the experiment for before we're likely to detect it? So to answer this question, we did a kind of power analysis. So essentially what this involved was making assumptions about possible values that this fishing effect could be, and then simulating possible future data, adding it to our current data, and then reapplying the model. So kind of 3 components. So we have the information that we have from our current data, which gives us, see that's a grey normal distribution, gives us sort of an idea of what we think the fishing effect could be. Then the blue, so that's from the data. Then we have a detection probability curve that we calculate from our simulated data. And that essentially gives us what's the probability of concluding from the data that there's an effect for different assumptions about what the true value is. And then the last thing is a threshold where you work with, this whole thing is very collaborative, so we work with biologists and all of that, and we try and decide at what point are we going to worry if so in this case, if the fishing effect is to the left of -0.1, then it's likely to have a meaningful impact on the penguin population. So then we combine all that information to get a detection probability. So that ends up looking something like this. And what this says is, so for this particular data set, these particular model assumptions, assuming that there is an impact of the fishing on the penguin population, what this plot tells us is that the experiment would have to continue for another 10 years before we can have an 80% chance of correctly coming to that conclusion from our data or detecting it in the data. It also tells us that if we only collect 5 years more worth of data, there's a relatively good chance that we won't detect the effect, even if it is there. So it seems pretty vague. So for the actual analysis that was the final analyses, we also included sort of risk assessments and levels and all of that. But essentially this formed the foundation for the advice that was given to management for going forward, whether to carry on this experiment or not. And in the end, the advice was that it would be worthwhile continuing with the experiment for at least a few more years, where we would be in a better position to try and say whether or not closing the islands would actually benefit the penguin in a meaningful way. And then it's obviously highly collaborative work. We can't do our work without the data. We can't do our work without input from the biologists, and also technical advice from various sources. So, thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrea. If you want to chat more with her about penguins, do it at the tea break, please.
Cool.